Good day. Before I proceed with this video, this is just a reminder to all of you who are watching us on Rumble, where we are now, by the way, on the home page, that if you go to the top of this video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that, that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you will find our community and our active community, which you can watch and follow and participate and join in, and where, by the way, we do lots of exclusive work, publish lots of exclusive content, indeed, including the live streams, which I do regularly every Wednesday. Can I also say that if you want to find me on locals, all you need to do is type Alexander Mercouris in the search bar, and that will take you directly to this channel. The Duran channel, our main channel, is now visible on our homepage. Right, thank you for that, and now I will proceed with the substance of today's video. Well, as I discussed yesterday, there have been telephone conversations, in fact, a huge flurry of telephone conversations over the course of Saturday between Vladimir Putin and various world leaders. Putin spoke to President Macron of France. That was a long-scheduled call. He also talked to President Biden of the United States. Now, it seems, if I have understood the information that's been provided by the Russians correctly, that there was in fact a scheduled call between Biden and Putin for Monday, but that the United States contacted the Russians and asked it to be brought forward to Saturday. Putin also spoke to President Lukashenko of Belarus. In the meantime, his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was contacted by Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, and General Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, contacted by telephone Sergei Shoigu, who is the Russian Defense Minister. And there were also follow-up telephone calls by Mark Milley, the General Milley, who is the chairman of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, and General Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of the Russian military's general staff. So intense discussions and negotiations over the course of Saturday. And of course, those were just the conversations between Putin and various foreign leaders. It seems that Macron has also been working the phones. He's had discussions with all sorts of people in the West, including, I believe, President Biden, though we don't yet have full details of these discussions. So lots of diplomatic activity yesterday. And can we say that there's been any real conclusion? Well, the answer is no, not in terms of any breakthrough. I mean, there's been no sudden diplomatic conclusion to all of this crisis, if it is a crisis, which we are now in. But we have obtained some clarity. And that clarity has come from the various statements and readouts that the Russians have provided. And I would stress that it's the Russians who are again providing the more informative readouts about their intentions. And of course, everything we've been reading about in the media amounts to guesswork about their intentions. And I would stress again that their readouts may be informative. We must be very careful not to say that informative is the same as reliable. Every country, every major power, when they provide readouts, provide them from their own perspective. And of course, there are structural biases and such things in these readouts, which means that we must read them with great care. Nonetheless, the readouts from the Russians are enlightening. And I will come to those in a moment. I will say that though I will be focusing in this program on the Russian readouts because they are more informative, I will provide links to the extremely uninformative White House readout of the telephone call between Biden and Putin and the briefing by the anonymous senior administration official, which we were also provided with by the White House a few hours after the Biden-Putin call. Both the readout and that briefing I found spectacularly uninformative. I don't think they provided us with any real light as to what exactly was discussed between these two leaders. The Russians have been much more informative about those, but for the sake of balance, I'm providing links to the American readouts as well. Anyway, let me just summarize my own understanding of what the Russian view of this is, or perhaps I should say of what the stated Russian view of this whole situation is. Firstly, it's clear that they have again categorically denied that they have any plan or intention to attack Ukraine. Secondly, the Russians believe themselves to be the target of a media campaign orchestrated by the United States and to some extent by Britain, and which is being carried out in order to put them in effect on some sort of defensive. By the way, on this particular point, they actually get some support from the US background briefing. It's quite interesting to see what one of the things that the senior administration official had to say. He says, whatever Russia decides, our assessment is that their efforts to improve their strategic position are already failing, and that this will only be exacerbated should they decide to take military action. And Russia is finding itself on defense in the information space, given our own transparency about its intentions. So this is an interesting admission from the Americans that this is really more about information, about trying to put the Russians on the defensive in using US dominance of the information space than perhaps a really substantive campaign about serious matters. Anyway, the Russians say that they have noticed this. They say that they are the target of an information campaign, but they're also saying, and this is perhaps the most concerning thing, that they worry that this media campaign, which in and of itself would simply cause them to shrug their shoulders, together with the arms supplies that Ukraine has been receiving over the last few months, may encourage the Ukrainians to engage in some sort of provocation, as the Russians put it, in eastern Ukraine, and that could very easily cause the situation to spiral out of control. We will see that the Russians return to this point repeatedly in their various comments. I think that they've already long since given up worrying about information space and information battles. They realize that because of the international dominance of the English language, the United States will always have an advantage over them there. I will touch on something that a Russian journalist, Fyodor Lukyanov, has had to say about this, which is to precisely that point. But at the same time, the Russians are more concerned, much more concerned, about a potential flare-up in Ukraine, which they see as being potentially caused both by this media campaign and by the weapons that the West is supplying to Ukraine. That, at least, is what the Russians are saying. Now, let's get on to the substantive discussions. The first thing to say is that there were two major conversations between Vladimir Putin and Western leaders. The first was with Emmanuel Macron of France, and it lasted for 1 hour and 40 minutes. And the Russians have provided a readout of that call. The second was between President Putin and President Biden of the United States. Interestingly and very unusually, the Russians have not so far published a readout of this call, though I presume they will eventually. But they've done something far more useful and far more interesting, and in some ways much more informative, which is that they have provided their own briefing. And this briefing was provided by a Russian official, Yuri Ushakov, who is a close foreign policy aide of Putin's, and who, as I understand it, participated, or at least was listening in on the conversation, and would, of course, afterwards have discussed with Putin and other officials what he should say over the course of this briefing. Now, I would say that once again, the Americans talk about their transparency, but of course, it is the Russians who are being more transparent in one respect, which is that in the case of the White House briefing about the Biden-Putin call, we are back to the anonymous senior administration official. As I've said many times, I simply do not understand the reason for all this mystification. There is a careful attempt, by the way, this time, to make it clear that this official, whoever he or she is, was not Jake Sullivan, because Jake Sullivan was referred to by this official in the third person. But anyway, we have this mysterious, unnamed senior administration official on the American side. The Russians on this point have been more transparent. They have identified the person who's providing their briefing as Yuri Ushakov. And now I will go directly to a discussion of what the Russian briefing says. And here I should say that the Russians have been slow in providing an official translation. What I'm going to provide is a translation from the Russian text, which I've made with some machine help. It may not be quite as authoritative as the eventual translation, which will be provided by the Kremlin itself, but I think it will do. Anyway, this is my reading, as I said, with the help of machines, of what Yuri Ushakov had to say. And it reads as follows. Briefing by aide to the President of Russia, Yuri Ushakov, following a telephone conversation between Vladimir Putin and Joseph Biden. And it's clear that this briefing was provided exclusively to the Russian media, or at least it was only the Russian media who were invited to answer questions. And here is how the briefing reads. Yuri Ushakov, good evening. A telephone conversation between the President of the Russian Federation and the President of the United States has just ended. The conversation went on for a little over an hour. This conversation became a kind of continuation of the Russian-American negotiations held on December 7th via video conference, as well as the telephone contact on December 30th. It was then that the leaders began discussing the most important topic today, namely the issues of ensuring long-term, legally fixed guarantees of the security of the Russian Federation. Today's conversation took place in an atmosphere of unprecedented hysteria by American officials about Russia's supposedly imminent invasion of Ukraine. By the way, referring to the likelihood of such a catastrophic scenario, the American side requested today's telephone contact of the presidents, although it was planned to hold this conversation at the beginning of next week on Monday. So that seems to me to be confirmation that this conversation between Biden and Putin was already scheduled and had already been agreed for Monday, but was brought forward at the request of the Americans to Saturday. To continue, similar requests for urgent calls have been made by other members of the administration who've spoken yesterday and today with many Russian colleagues. That is the escalation around the topic of invasion. The word invasion is in quotation marks in the Russian text of this, in the Russian transcript of this briefing. That is the escalation around the topic of invasion was carried out in a coordinated manner, and the hysteria reached its climax. But if we return to the conversation between the presidents of the United States and of Russia, we can state that the nature of the conversation was still quite balanced and businesslike. And President Biden even referred to the experience of his predecessors, who during the Cold War did everything possible to avoid a catastrophe, to avoid a serious conflict between our countries. He said that our two great powers are still competitors, but that they must do everything to maintain stability and security throughout the world. He also stressed that it is necessary to do everything possible to avoid the worst scenario in the context of the current situation around Ukraine. He, as he said, is an adherent of the diplomatic path, and in this regard he outlined a number of considerations that, in his opinion, take into account many of the Russian concerns and initiatives outlined and transmitted by us to the Americans and NATO in the draft documents on security assurances. I will immediately note that the Russian president reacted in the spirit that the Russian side, of course, will carefully analyse the considerations expressed by Biden, and we will undoubtedly take them into account. But unfortunately, and this has been said, these considerations do not affect the central key element of Russian initiatives. In fact, neither on the non-expansion of NATO, nor on the non-deployment of strike forces on Ukrainian territory, nor on the return of the configuration of the alliance's forces to the state of 1997, when the Russia-NATO Founding Act was signed. We did not receive a substantive response. Many of the steps announced in the telephone conversation are already, in general, contained in the responses we received on January 26th from Washington and NATO headquarters to the Russian proposals. Joseph Biden, expectedly, in the context of the tense situation around Ukraine, mentioned possible tough anti-Russian sanctions, but at the same time, this was not the issue that was emphasized in the entrance of a rather lengthy conversation with the Russian leader. Our president, for his part, outlined in detail the principled approaches of the Russian side, and explained why right now there is a need to address issues on which Russia's national security really depends. President Putin also went through the history of relations between the United States, NATO, and Russia, which ultimately led to a crisis situation. The president of Russia, in particular, noted that during the years of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States were, of course, 100% adversaries, and, for example, in the 1990s, we seemed to be friends. But even then, the United States and NATO were far from constructive in relation to Russia. After all, it was then that the practical expansion of the scope of NATO's activities began. It was then that new members were admitted and the alliance approached the borders of Russia. After that, already in the 2000s, there was a sharp degradation of security conditions in the Euro-Atlantic space, and this degradation was precisely related to the security of our country. So Putin set out the history leading up to this situation, this crisis. I should say that there are reports that the British have been circulating to various Western governments and to the British media complaints that the Russians are focusing too much on historical questions and are not looking at fundamental practical existing issues. For the Russians, of course, the history is absolutely centrally important, and if one doesn't understand that, then one doesn't understand anything at all about this crisis. So far as the Russians are concerned, what has led to this crisis has been a step of Western actions extending back to the time of the end of the Cold War, and they're not prepared to do that which the Americans and the British repeatedly want to do, which is to ignore the past and act as if the past never happened, and to start and look forward to some future that is uninformed by the past. So I just wanted to make that observation because it's obviously something that arises clearly from this transcript of this discussion. What else would I like to point out? In no less detail, the President of Russia highlighted the destructive line of the Ukrainian authorities to sabotage the Minsk agreements, which has been going on for the past 8 years. At the same time, he noted that due pressure is not being exercised on the part of Western states so that Kiev fulfills its obligations. Our president also drew attention to the dangers of the militarization of Ukraine, its pumping with modern weapons, which Western countries are purposefully doing, thereby encouraging possible provocations by the Ukrainian security forces, both in relation to Donbass and in relation to Crimea. So there's a reference to the fact that the Russians are concerned that the media campaign and the arming of Ukraine could set the scene for future provocations. Anyway, to continue, taking into account the doctrinal guidelines of Ukraine, which directly proclaim the goal of returning Crimea by force, its hypothetical entry into NATO is, of course, fraught with the most dangerous consequences, including a direct military confrontation between Russia and the alliance, if only because the United States itself considers the sacred fifth article of the Washington Treaty. That's a misunderstanding. It's the 10th article, but never mind. Our president spoke about this in sufficient detail during today's conversation. On the whole, the presidents agreed that the views expressed by Biden would be carefully considered in Moscow and, if possible, taken into account in our reaction to the position papers received from the United States and NATO. We will bring this reaction to the attention of partners and the public in the near future. Taking into account the fact that, as Joseph Biden says, he wants interstate relations between Russia and the United States to be built on the basis of mutual respect, the presidents agreed to continue contacts at various levels on all issues raised today in a telephone conversation. In general, the conversation was of a business-like nature, I would like to emphasize once again. So, quite a lot of information here. The Russians, when they talk about an information campaign being waged against them, they're making it very clear that as far as they are concerned, the purpose of this information campaign is to refocus the entire issue on Ukraine to make it appear as if it is Ukraine that is the topic of discussion, whereas as far as the Russians are concerned, the topic for discussion, the key issue, is their quest for legally binding security guarantees. These include a commitment by NATO to stop eastward expansion, which would, of course, conceivably one day take in Ukraine, and also to dismantle their infrastructure, their military infrastructure in the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, which has been established by NATO since 1997. So that is what the Russians are focused on. They're not focused on Ukraine. They see the media campaign, the propaganda campaign directed against them as an attempt to put them on the defensive and to just draw attention away from their quest for legally binding security guarantees and to focus it instead on Ukraine. So that's one thing he said. That's one thing that the Russians are saying. But beyond that, they did have certain things to say about Ukraine. They made it clear again that they're not interested in invading the country. This is all hysteria being whipped up by the United States. They want the conflict in Ukraine settled on the basis of the full implementation of the Minsk agreement, and they are concerned that the United States and the other Western powers, instead of facilitating that end, are working to sabotage it by supporting the Ukrainians in their intransigent refusal to implement fully the Minsk agreement. And I would add that there's again been talks within the Normandy format in Berlin a few days ago to try to get the Minsk agreement, work forward with the Minsk agreement. But those talks came to a complete standstill because, again, the Ukrainians refused outright to talk to the leaders of the Donbass, the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as by the way they are required to do by the Minsk agreement. They even apparently said that for them it was a red line, and the French and the Germans didn't intervene to try to get the Ukrainians to agree to do this. Briefly on that, I think the French are utterly impatient and exasperated with Ukrainian intransigence on this question, but the Germans, still nervous about possible sanctions against Nord Stream 2, are not yet ready to put pressure on the Ukrainians to change their stance, and without the Germans changing their stance, the French don't feel able to do so. So that was what happened during that meeting in Berlin a few days ago, and the Russians have issued further comments claiming that they've now received a position paper provided by the US State Department and circulated to all NATO member states. They claim that they were provided by one NATO member state, by the government of one NATO member state, they've not said which one, with a copy of this position paper. And apparently and allegedly, this position paper provided by the State Department gives instructions to all NATO member states to dig in their heels and to support Ukraine in their stance in not proceeding forward with negotiations on the basis of the Minsk agreement. This position paper supposedly dates from around a month ago, though the Russians say that they understand that there have been other ones circulated by the State Departments before. I haven't seen this paper. I don't know whether it exists. Maybe that the Russians are making it up. I believe, for what it's worth, that it probably does exist, but without seeing it, I'm not going to comment further on what it says. So there we are. That is the impasse that's been reached. The Russians say they have no intention of invading Ukraine. This is an information campaign being launched against them by the West, by the United States, with the intention of taking the focus away from Russia's quest for legally binding security guarantees, to prevent the discussion focusing on the construction of the new security architecture for Europe, and to focus it instead on Ukraine by fomenting an artificial war scare around this issue. But the Russians also say that the risk in doing the second is that it could give someone in Ukraine the idea of launching some kind of provocation, in which case it's quite possible that the situation could spiral out of control, and for that reason this approach is extremely dangerous. And then there were a series of questions, and there were questions obviously from the Russian media, and they were principally about the danger of this alleged invasion of Ukraine that the Russians are supposed to be preparing. And in response to these questions, Ushakov said things like the following: "You know perfectly well that tensions have been escalating around the movement of our troops across our territory, albeit not far from the Ukrainian border, for more than a month. And in recent days, the situation has simply been brought to the point of absurdity." I completely agree with this, but the facts are that the Americans are artificially inflating hysteria around the so-called planned Russian invasion. They even name the dates of this invasion, in inverted commas, in the transcript, and in parallel, together with their allies, they are pumping up the military muscles of Ukraine. Significant financial resources are being allocated for the modernization of Ukraine's army, and the number of army instructors sent is increasing. That is to the accompaniment of allegations of an invasion, again in inverted commas, and prerequisites are being created for possible provocative actions of the Ukrainian armed forces. So that's the danger. And then he said how long. Then he was asked how long could this continue for, and he said, "I don't know. It's the Americans who are choosing this path. We have outlined our considerations and stressed several times that we do not understand why we should give the mass media deliberately false information about our Russian intentions. Why they should give the mass media deliberately false information about our Russian intentions." And then he was asked about the submarine incident. This is the incident of the Virginia-class submarine, which encroached on the Sea of Okhotsk. The Russians say that it entered their territorial waters. The Americans deny this. I suspect that it was in the territorial waters of one of the Kuril Islands, which the Russians consider to be part of their national territory, but which the United States claims to recognize as Japanese territory. Anyway, Ushakov was asked whether this issue was brought up, and he said no, and that this would be discussed between the defense ministries, and was not mentioned during the conversation between the presidents, and essentially that was the discussion. Now, it went on for an hour. Note that the issue of sanctions was only touched upon. It's quite clear that most of the conversation was about Russia's legally binding security guarantees, and with Biden making various, I think, empty comments which I doubt the Russians are particularly interested in or impressed by, about how the United States and Russia can work together on all sorts of things, and that peace and mutual respect is what is needed. But so far, the Russians are saying he's not addressing any of the issues of substance. So the Russians categorically deny any intention to invade Ukraine. They don't discount the possibility of a war in Ukraine. On the contrary, they think the chances of that are increasing because of the weapons Ukraine has received, and because the media campaign sets up the possibility of some kind of provocation, as they call it, in eastern Ukraine. But they have no plan or intention themselves to launch a war against Ukraine. What they want, what their focus is on their quest for legally binding security guarantees. Macron, by the way, who spoke with Putin on several occasions and who met him last week for many hours, has confirmed that it is the quest for legally binding security guarantees that, for the Russians, is the main topic of the discussions. And of course, Macron also spoke to Putin. And the important thing here is that he spoke to Putin for much longer than Biden did. Biden spoke with Putin for just over an hour. Macron spoke to Putin for 1 hour and 40 minutes, which again suggests a negotiation of some kind being underway. And the Russians this time have provided a readout, and I will read it out. Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, at the French side's initiative. And the readout reads, in the follow-up to the discussions during President Macron's recent visit to Moscow, the two leaders had an in-depth exchange of opinions on the issues related to ensuring long-term legal security guarantees for the Russian Federation and overcoming the stalemate in the settling of the intra-Ukrainian conflict, including in view of Emmanuel Macron's conversations with the leaders of Ukraine, the United States, and a number of European states. Vladimir Putin once again drew attention to the absence of a substantive response from the United States and NATO to the Russian initiatives. He also stressed the reluctance of the leading Western powers to prompt the Kiev authorities to implement the Minsk agreements, which was demonstrated again by the futility of the February 10th round of consultations in Berlin between political advisors to the Normandy format leaders. Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron also discussed the situation concerning provocative speculations regarding the alleged planned Russian invasion again in quotation marks, of Ukraine, which is accompanied by massive supplies of modern weaponry to Ukraine, thus creating conditions for possible aggressive actions by the Ukrainian military in Donbass. The leaders agreed to keep these issues on the agenda of the Russian-French top-level dialogue. In addition, they touched upon the preservation and full-fledged compliance with the joint comprehensive plan of action on Iran's nuclear program. So that might suggest a very similar discussion to the one between Biden and Putin, but it was much longer, and I suspect that Putin probably made clear to Macron Russian exasperation with the stance taken by France and Germany at the Berlin meeting on 10th February, when France and Germany sat silent as Ukraine again repeatedly refused to speak to the leaders of the Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And I suspect that Macron tried to reassure him that the French remain fully committed to the full implementation of the Minsk agreement, though clearly there are difficulties at the moment in working their way through. And undoubtedly, Macron will have told Putin that, of course, if there is a war over the next few days, if there is indeed a Russian attack on Ukraine, then all his efforts to find some kind of way forward with the Russian quest for legally binding security guarantees, all of that will go up in smoke. And, of course, the possibilities of a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict along the lines of the Minsk agreement will also fail, and that it will be impossible for Macron, to continue maintaining contacts with the Russians along the same issues in future. So he will have given the Russians that warning, but the Russians, as I said, will have pressed their points both about Ukraine and about the legally binding security guarantees, which clearly, despite all that we are hearing, remain the key issue so far as the Russians are concerned. So, before I proceed, I'm going to point out that there's been a rather interesting discussion on the RT website by Fyodor Lukyanov. This is a very well briefed and very competent Russian journalist, and he explains that in this current standoff between Russia and the Western powers, each side is playing to its particular strengths. And he says the following: both sides are trying to gain the upper hand by relying on their competitive advantages. Russia's advantage comes from the fact that its military capabilities and the potential zone of conflict are far beyond those of the US and NATO, and that Russia is in a position to apply force should the worst possible scenario be realized. Western nations, on the other hand, emphasize that they would not, under any circumstances, get directly involved in the conflict. America's advantage lies in its international dominance over the realm of media and information, including its ability to construct a global narrative favorable to itself and highly unfavorable to Russia. Quote, Moscow is a predatory and ruthless aggressor. It's everyone's duty to oppose Russia. Basically, run for your lives before it is too late. The US is already using this tool to the fullest extent so that it disregards the interests of the country it purports to protect, Ukraine, dismissing its feeble pleas for America to stop whipping up information hysteria. So that's a Russian perspective on this. Note, by the way, that Lukyanov, and I suspect the Russians too, see America's primary advantage as its control of the information space rather than in its threat of sanctions. The Russians are not intimidated by the sanctions. That doesn't concern them very much. They don't consider the sanctions threat to be the US's primary weapon. They see US dominance in the information space as the US's dominant weapon. One, however, which on the issue of Ukraine, Russia can counter with the fact that it has immeasurably greater military power which it can bring to bear in this specific region, Ukraine and Eastern Europe, though not, of course, globally. Well, there we are. Now, I'm going to say, first of all, what I think is most likely to happen. I personally believe that it is in no one's interest to start a war over Ukraine. It's quite interesting that the Americans have been relocating their embassy, and so have various other Western powers, to the western city of Lvov, which suggests that there is some kind of contingency plan that if the Russians do invade Ukraine and capture Kiev, that some kind of rump Ukrainian state will be preserved in western Ukraine, in this region of Galicia, even as the Russians consolidate their control of the rest, and that will be the Ukraine that they will continue to recognize, and that will be the Ukraine that we will continue to ensure has control of Ukraine's UN Security Council, or UN seat. Anyway, that does seem to me to be a contingency plan. But on balance, and in spite of all of this, I still don't believe that there is going to be a war in Ukraine. Obviously, I mean, I think it is incredibly unlikely, to the point of fantastic implausibility, that the Russians are planning on such a war, because as far as they're concerned, a war of that nature would complicate and, in fact, arguably destroy their attempts at the moment to obtain that which they are seeking, which is those legally binding security guarantees, which don't just include an end to NATO's eastward expansion, but also the dismantling of NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe. Obviously, the Russians have their red lines. If there is some kind of Ukrainian invasion in the Donbass, then Russia will act. And of course, if the United States moves troops into Ukraine, then the Russians will react also. At the moment, of course, the United States, far from moving troops into Ukraine, is busy taking them out. I'm going to come to what that means in a moment. But anyway, I don't think the Russians, as I said, have any plan to invade Ukraine. I don't see what the logic for them in doing it is. What they want to see is the Ukrainian internal conflict settled. I think they're getting assurances from Macron that once this particular crisis is is over, and Nord Stream 2 is operating, then the French and the Germans will finally get on the job and will try to get Minsk working again. We shall see. But I don't think that this is the Russian game plan. It could be somebody else's game plan. And of course, we see how the Russians are harping on about provocation tactics and how the Americans, for their part, and the British are talking about false flags. I'm going to say something about this. Firstly, as I don't think the Russians have any plan or any desire to invade Ukraine. I can't see what reason they would have for staging a false flag. And as for Ukraine staging a false flag, well, there are some extremely fervid and obsessive people in Ukraine, fanatical people in Ukraine. But I do have to say that staging a false flag in eastern Ukraine, or staging some kind of provocation in eastern Ukraine, for no other purpose than so that the United States can impose its sanctions on Russia, does seem to me a rather strange approach to take. If Ukraine thought that by staging some kind of provocation in eastern Ukraine and drawing the Russians into war, they would get US and Western military support, and which might result in a war, which Ukraine might conceivably, with American and British and NATO backing, might win. Well, I can imagine, delusional though that would be, that the Ukrainians would have some incentive to do it. But I do wonder whether that incentive exists, given that the only outcome of such a war would be the destruction of Ukraine, and the only benefit would go to those in the United States who want to impose sanctions on Russia, which by that point would be of no conceivable benefit to Ukraine at all. So whilst I'm not discounting the danger that someone in Ukraine might do something extremely foolish, all I would say is that if you're looking at this from a Ukrainian perspective, it would require an unusual and unusually fanatical personality to decide to do something like that, where the only outcome would be, as I said, Ukraine's destruction and sanctions on Russia, which would be of no conceivable benefit to Ukraine at all. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. As I said, I'm not discounting the possibility. That possibility is always there. All I am saying that with Western actions, the West pulling its troops out of Ukraine, relocating its embassies to Lvov, telling all its people to leave Ukraine, it doesn't seem to me as if, from Ukraine's point of view, starting a war at this time is at all a good idea. So that leads me to think that the probable eventual outcome is that the drills, the maneuvers, the exercises the Russian army is conducting in Belarus, which are due to end on Sunday, 20th February, will indeed end on that day, and that far from there being a war over this period, the Russian troops will, as Sergei Lavrov told Liz Truss during that bizarre meeting they had on Thursday, that those Russian troops will then return to their barracks in Russia. That, I think, is the most likely outcome. But obviously, in a period of extreme tension like this, the danger of something going wrong simply cannot be underestimated. And whilst I think that a war is unlikely, because I can't see whose purpose it serves, at least whose purpose it serves in Russia or Ukraine, the dangers are there, and if it happens, it will be a disaster. But, of course, such things can happen. Things can go hideously wrong, and it's always best in these kind of situations to avoid finding oneself in a situation where something like that might actually happen. I'm going to finish by making one very final point, and that is that I think that this is, in a strange sort of way, the beginning of the West's abandonment of Ukraine. Now, we've heard a great deal about Western support of Ukraine, but consider what has actually happened. At the very first word of a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine, a word which the Western powers themselves have circulated, what do? They pull out all their troops. No talk of these troops being there as any kind of tripwire. That's all gone. No talk about those troops continuing to help you train the Ukrainian soldiers. That's all gone as well. They've pulled out all their embassy staffs. They've relocated them to Lvov. They've abandoned Kiev. They've also told all their people to leave Ukraine. Now, that looks to me like an abandonment of the country. Perhaps some of these people, some of those advisors, some of those troops, some of those diplomats will return when this is all over. But the Ukrainians have now been given an object lesson in the fact that if they're up against the Russians, they are entirely on their own. The Americans have made it absolutely clear that they're not prepared to fight the Russians. They're certainly not prepared to fight the Russians in Ukraine. That means that this Ukrainian quest for NATO and EU membership is once and forever dead, and that the Americans and the Europeans are not prepared not just to fight for Ukraine, but to do anything meaningful for Ukraine if it finds itself in any sort of crisis with Russia. And what that leads to, or so it seems to me, is an eventual calculus starting to crystallize in Western capitals, that this game with Ukraine, this cruel game that has been played with Ukraine over these last 8 years, is probably reaching the point when it simply can't be sustained anymore. And when, as happened recently in Afghanistan, the time has come for the Western powers to pull out and leave Ukraine on its own. Anyway, on that thought, I will end this video. We will see what happens over the next couple of days. We will see whether my expectation, it's not a prediction, but my odds-on expectation that war will be avoided is correct. And in the meantime, obviously, correct or not, I will be back to continue to discuss what's happening and to analyse the news. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, and of course also now on Rumble, where, as I said, you can find us on the homepage, and on Locals, where, as I said, we have our thriving community, and on our various other platforms. You can also support us via PayPal and Subscribestar. Sorry, Patreon and Subscribestar, not PayPal. PayPal's long gone. Patreon and Subscribestar. You'll find links under this video. And of course, please remember to go to our shop where you'll find all sorts of amazing things. Our Good Day mugs, our other magic mugs, our t-shirts, our amazing new bomber jackets, which are now appearing there on Monday. And thank you for joining me again today. Please remember to check your subscription to this channel and to press the like button. And I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day wherever you are.